Okay, good evening or good morning, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to a session on mental health called Mental Health Matters. My name is Jay Thompson. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, mental health nurse, and mental health first aid instructor. But most importantly, I'm a scout. I'm from a small island called the Isle of Man, which is between Ireland and England, part of UK scouting. And I'm currently in Gloucestershire delivering a mental health first aid course over the last 2 days. But this is a big fleur-de-lis behind me. This isn't my living room. Yeah, really glad that you can join us today to talk about mental health. Before we get going, I just want to put a word of warning. The fact that we talk about mental health can be quite emotionally heavy and quite difficult. So just to recognize how we're feeling and how we're reacting to this content, and do seek support from friends or family, or through the Safe from Harm support through Jyoti if needs be, and look after yourself as we go through this content. So before we think about what is mental health, we need to think about what is health and take a little step backwards. When we think about health, we need to think about mental, physical, and social health, and how that all comes together to form our health. There is no health without mental health. It is very much part of our broader health and well-being. So, for example, our physical health is about our physiological, biological state. Our social health is about our community and our safety. And our mental health is about how we think and feel, like we will cover further into this session. But there is no health without mental health. Importantly, it matters, because if we can't think about mental health, if we don't understand how to support other people in a mental health and supportive way, then we're not going to help people as broadly as we can. When it comes to our mental health, there's a World Health Organization definition that I quite like using. The definition, I'll read it out, is mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. Now, to me, that sounds very much like scouting. That sounds very scout-wordy. So, for example, realizes her or his potential, can cope with normal stresses, can work productively and fruitfully, and making a contribution to your community. That is very much a scouting theme. And the reason I say this is because scouting has always contributed to the mental health of young people and adult volunteers. It's always been a positive force for change and good. And the theme of mental health is nothing new in scouting. However, perhaps mental health as a theme is something we've not talked about enough in scouting, and we need to talk more about it. When it comes to what our mental health is, this is very much framed as a health. So when we're in a good health, what does that look like? What is health? And that's helpful because often when we think about mental health, we think about it straight away as illness. And that's perhaps a stigmatizing view, perhaps that's quite unhelpful at times. Of course, people can become very unwell and very poorly, but we also need to recognize what health is as well, so we can aspire towards helping people become more well, or to help ourselves become more well. Mental health then is about how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. It's about how we see ourselves and the world around us. It's about how we value ourselves. And it's about how we experience the world. It's about how we react to the world. Our mental health is constantly changing. And our mental health is something we experience every single day. I want to talk a little bit more about that and think about these 4 or 5 areas rather. So a thought, what is a thought? Maybe some of us have had some thoughts today. It's a cognition, it's a process. It's our brain calculating and interpreting the world around us. It's about how we react to situations, but it's also about how we process events and memories themselves as well. Our emotions are about our response and our evaluation of certain situations. So if it's more than one word, I don't know how this translates across different languages and cultures, but generally, if it's more than one word, it's probably a thought. So emotions can be things like happy, sad, anger, disgust, excited, fed up could be maybe a slightly almost a two-word thing, overwhelmed, but it's generally one or two words, and it's a way of appraising a situation. Our physical, and a big emotion there to add in is fear. Fear is absolutely an emotion too. And our physical responses, physiological responses that we have in our body as well are very much part of this as well. And the last thing there is behavior. So how we behave, how we interact, what we avoid, what we do or don't do. So if we think about a situation, let's say we're walking into Scouts and we stub our toe or we hurt our toe on the door frame. What possible thoughts might you have in that moment? So the situation is hurting my toe. The thoughts might be, oh no, I've done that. We might physically feel pain. Our emotions might be a bit of anger maybe, or a bit of embarrassment. And our physical response is clearly pain. So how we interact and how we behave is changed instantly by this situation. And that's a very simple situation. It complicates it more when, if we think about that same situation, but perhaps we've already got an existing injury. So that influences how we think and feel in that situation, because like even maybe in more pain, or we remember more vividly being in pain recently. So it's really quite complicated, but all these 4 or 5 areas interact in a really complex way. And being able to spot and understand these different areas can be key to understanding what our mental health is. Why mental health matters is because if we're not thinking about mental health, if we're not understanding our mental health, we're simply neglecting a huge part of what it is to be human. Mental health is nothing new. It is something that humans have evolved and lived with over thousands of years. We've developed these ways of thinking and ways of behaving and ways of responding to certain maybe situations or certain environmental factors, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic or a global financial recession or issues, or maybe a war, or maybe the influence of social media. There's all these current kind of things happening, but in the background, humans haven't changed a huge deal. These processes, these mechanisms are still very much happening just as they have done for a long, long time. So the more we understand that, the better we are to understand and work through our mental health. Our mental health exists along a continuum. On one end, we might have what we could consider as health, and on the other, we could think about illness. There is no absolutes to this. There is no kind of, you get to 10, you get to level 10 and everything's great. That's perfect, you made it. Our mental health is constantly fluctuating, constantly moving up and down the continuum. And this is maybe oversimplistic as a concept, as a kind of linear line, but perhaps we can understand it a little bit on this. And if you go and further read, you can add more depth to this, but it's just a bit of a concept to get our head around. Let's say, whenever you woke up this morning, where were you on that continuum? Where are you now? The likelihood is it's changed. The likelihood is maybe small life events, small changes, perhaps attending a Jyoti session. Maybe that's changed your mental health slightly. And we're talking maybe about small changes. Bigger life events, bigger changes, it can influence our mental health in much greater ways. For example, a bereavement, for example, a big physical health change, experiencing poor mental health can change where we are on that continuum. What I should have said earlier is that if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We should have some time at the end to go through them. So find the little Q&A section of the Zoom call and feel free to ask questions. I'm more than happy to answer any questions people put up there. It's important to recognize that when we think about illness, it's not necessarily diagnosable difficulties that we're talking about. We can think about it in terms of how we see how we see our mental health and how our mental health changes over time. It could very much be specific difficulties such as depression or an anxiety disorder, such as generalized anxiety disorder or a phobia or agoraphobia. There's lots of different types of things that we can think about when it comes to different sorts of mental health difficulties. But we can actually see this as a continuum and realize that our mental health is continuously flowing. So let's think a little bit more about why are we talking about mental health and scouting? I think what's really important to recognize here is that scouting has always influenced young people and adults' mental health. It's always been relevant, it's always been there. Scouting has a very big positive impact on the mental health of young people. We know this from people telling their own story. I know scouting has massively increased my mental health, and I'm sure you will all have similar stories too. However, we also know from various pieces of research that mental health improves in scouting. There's been various research studies comparing scouts, people who have accessed scouting as a young person, and people that haven't, and understanding what are the differences. We know in certain areas, things such as resiliency or the ability to bounce back is increased in people that have been in scouting. Some of the biggest things that can influence a young person's mental health in a positive way can be feeling that they're part of something bigger, feeling a sense of belonging, working towards goals, being active in their community, feeling valued. And for me, that's why scouting is effective, because if scouting is done well, that is our focus. For example, an activity that I love doing with my scouts, we call it shark-infested custard. And I'm not sure how well this translates across different languages. However, the idea is we've got a hall and we've got maybe a group of 5 scouts and another group of 5 scouts, and they get 4 pieces of carpet square. And the idea is they've got to get across the hall, passing the carpet. I'm sure you've played similar games, passing the carpet along the line and stepping on each piece of carpet. You get the idea, hopefully. And the idea is to avoid touching the floor because it's infested with sharks. The custard has got sharks in it. Now, the question is, are we preparing young people with the skills to avoid getting eaten by sharks in custard? This really isn't going to translate, but not really, are we? Like, there's not many situations where actually using carpet squares to get across custard is going to be a life skill. However, what they're learning is communication, what they're learning is teamwork, what they're learning is how to work together and how to support each other through it, how to problem solve. And those are skills that help young people's mental health. We know that if we work on mental health awareness, we reduce stigma, it will create a better world, which is our whole worldwide goal, to create a better world. When we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, we think about health, and health is very much involving mental health. But specifically there is specific reference to suicide prevention, and preventing suicide is absolutely something that scouting already does because of the way in which we deliver our programs and our education. However, we can do more. We can be more ambitious with supporting young people and adult volunteers' mental health. I just want you to think on your own there and think, how has scouting influenced my mental health? Perhaps we've had negative experiences at times in scouting. Perhaps that's negatively influenced our mental health. I know as a volunteer, at various points where my mental health hasn't been good through my life, I would experience what I would consider to be depression, triggered by the death of a very close friend to suicide. And I know that for me, was a really difficult time in my life, and I had a lot of scouting responsibility at the time. And I know that really negatively impacted my mental health because I wasn't able to do the things I wanted to be able to do. So it's important that we're able to look after ourselves, recognize where scouting does good, but also recognize where we maybe need to slow down and maybe need to take a step back to look after our mental health as well. I want to introduce this idea of a stress container or a stress bucket. I want you to imagine that we all have this capacity to deal with the stress and the pressure that life throws at us. And generally, we would expect a person's capacity to deal with stress to grow over time. So we'd expect a 8-year-old to have a smaller container than when they're 10. We'd expect it to grow. You couldn't compare two people's buckets because they've got different life experiences, but you'd expect that individual's bucket to grow, their capacity to deal with what life threw at them to grow. And things that help their bucket grow are protective factors, things such as having secure accommodation, having enough food and water and clothing, having access to education, having meaningful friendships and relationships, and being able to achieve their goals. Be able to go to scouts is a protective factor. So the things that might be a risk factor, so things that might reduce or hold back their bucket from growing, may be things like trauma, things like big stresses in their life, or bereavement, or not having access to some of the things I've mentioned. But let's think about our own bucket and our own capacity to deal with the world around us. Generally, it grows, gradually it grows. And stress and life events and changes go into our bucket. Now, stress, the idea of stress, the word, what it means is a pressure, things, change happening. And that adds to the amount of things we've got to deal with. So it could be something to do with jobs, could be something to do with school or education. It could be a financial difficulty. It could be something really difficult in somebody's life, like a bereavement. But there's stress, there's pressure going in. Positive life events can very much be a stress. For example, a wedding, a funeral, that's obviously not a positive event, but maybe a family gathering. It might also be taking on a promotion or taking on extra responsibility. So it's important to recognize that stressful events can also be positive ones. However, they still go in our bucket. So to add to this analogy further, we can think about it in terms of taps that help release some of that stress. So the idea is stress flows into this bucket, and then the taps help release some of that stress. Playing a game at Scouts may be releasing that. Going on camp may be a release. Going for a run may be a release. Or speaking to a friend, or having a chat with somebody in your family. These things are things that help release the stress. However, sometimes these taps can get blocked, or we stop using them because sometimes the stress, the level of that bucket gets so much that it overflows. And we stop doing the things that help because we're too stressed. We've got to prioritize. We think, I can't go to Scouts tonight because I've got too much schoolwork or too much education or too much of my job to do. And then we stop doing the things that help. If we think about this bucket as well, the fuller it gets, the less capacity I've got left to deal with new things that come along. And when that bucket gets to a certain point, it then overflows. So that may be, we might feel really anxious at that point. We might feel really low in mood or maybe depressed at that point. But the idea is that bucket gets fuller and fuller and fuller and then overflows. So these taps, they allow some of this stress to be removed. Sometimes they get blocked because we stop doing the things that help, because in the short term, we think that might be useful because we've got to prioritize. But in the long term, the bucket gets fuller. Another part of this is when we do things that help, or they seem to help in the short term, but there's a longer term consequence. So, for example, on the taps, we can also put on a hose pipe. And a hose pipe in this story, this analogy, is something that helps in the short term, but then later has a negative consequence. So, for example, we could think of this as alcohol. People use alcohol to cope with stress sometimes. However, the consequence on our mental and physical health can be really negative, depending on how in excess that coping thing is used. But in the short term, there's this relief, but then the hose pipe goes back into the bucket later, maybe the next morning, maybe longer term, on physical health costs or financial costs of that behavior. It adds to the stress. So other things like that could be anything in excess. It could be running. It could be yoga. It could be spending time with friends, but to the point where maybe that person is avoiding the other things in their life they need to do. So in the long term, that makes things more stressful for them. It's clearly there's things that would take a lot longer to become excessive and unhelpful than other things such as drug and alcohol use. But we need to recognize that there's no good or bad coping. It's not as simple as that. There is coping. And as humans, we don't tend to cope. We don't tend to do the same thing repeatedly unless there's some element of it being helpful, even to a small extent. There's got to be some element of relief for us to keep doing the same thing. So when we're thinking about somebody that's maybe coping in some unhelpful ways in the long term, we need to think, well, there's something in it that's helping them cope in the short term. So it's important that we don't just take those things away, but we think about what else can they do to cope? What alternatives are there? How else can we help that person? And what else will relieve that stress? So hopefully we can understand this stress bucket idea, the idea that we have this capacity, the idea that stress flows in, which could be scouting, it could be work, it could be school, it could be relationships, it could be finances. And we have taps that can release some of that stress, but also that can become hose pipes, which eventually feed back into our stress in the long term. There's one more element to this that I would like to add, and that's that when our stress bucket overflows, it's key that we know when I'm at 9 out of 10, let's say, 9 out of 10, I'm really full, and I'm on the edge of it overflowing. What does that look like for me? Do I get really anxious? Do I get really grumpy? Do I get angry? Do I withdraw? And knowing yourself and what that looks like at that point is really helpful in being able to prevent things from getting worse and being able to know when to get help. Think also about my friends and my family. What are their stress signatures? Would this be a helpful conversation to have? Perhaps people are going on Jamboree this year, or next year, sorry, to the World Scout Jamboree or a different Jamboree. You're going to be on camp for a long time. If you're a leader, what are my fellow leaders' stress signatures? What does it look like when they're full? Because if I know that and they know mine, we can look after each other much more effectively. And it's the same with young people if you're going as a participant. What are my friends? What are my tent buddies? What are their signs that they're really struggling? Because if I know that, I can pick up on that and make suggestions. Or, for me, I know I can function on very little sleep. However, I know I need to eat lots of food. If I'm hungry, I'm awful, okay? But I can function on sleep. So if I was with a leader that needed a lot of sleep, I'd be like, right, okay, time to, I'll do the early shift, but do you think you could grab an extra snack and I'll have that and bring that along at lunchtime and I'll grab that off you? Is that all right? So working out a bit of a plan for how you can cope will also be helpful. And we're doing well for time, so do ask some questions. We will be coming in to look at questions towards the last 5 to 10 minutes or so. Do use that Q&A option, anything you feel like asking. There's no bad questions or wrong questions to ask. So these are some ideas around what you can do to improve your mental health. And this comes from the idea that when it comes to our mental health, we often do things that keep the problem going. So as a therapist, this is something I'll work on with a lot of people. So it might be a case of what keeps the problem going. So maybe, for example, I feel low, I feel tired, I feel like I've not got any energy, so I don't go and spend time with friends. But then I feel bored, so I don't go out, and I don't get the benefit of being with friends, so I feel worse. So the next day I feel more motivated, so I don't go out, so I feel worse. So these vicious cycles are really common when it comes to anxiety or depression, or any sort of mental health difficulty, really. For example, sleep is a huge part of our mental and physical health. If I don't sleep, I feel tired. If I feel tired, I don't have energy. If I don't have energy, I don't do things that I enjoy, which makes my mood low. I then worry about not going and doing what I want to be able to do, which keeps me awake at night. So these cycles go round and around and around, and in a really vicious way sometimes. So recognizing what cycles are going on in your life or a friend's life and listening to that and thinking about how we could reverse some of those cycles can be really important for our mental health. There's this idea of ACEs, achievement, closeness, and enjoyment. These are three areas that I think we can all do something in to help our mental health. So achievement, for example, is about how we feel we've succeeded. What do we feel like we've achieved today? What do we feel like we've managed to do or challenged ourselves to do? Maybe you've earned a badge. Maybe you've gone somewhere that you were a bit nervous about going to and it was really good. And maybe you've asked for help. That's a huge achievement for a lot of people. Maybe it's you've been working hard at school or at work and you've got to Friday or Saturday and you think, oh, okay, I've really achieved this week. I've done a lot. Closeness is about our connection with other people, how connected we are to them, how emotionally tuned in we are together. Closeness, it's important. Depression is a lot that drives depression and anxiety is loneliness. And loneliness is not about how close physically I am to somebody else. It's about connection. You can be lonely in a room full of people that love you and care for you genuinely, but feel lonely, feel cut off. Whereas you can feel completely connected to the world, camping in the hills by yourself. So loneliness isn't about proximity or closeness, physical closeness to somebody. However, it's about that connection with other people. It's about how heard I feel. It's about how understood I feel, how much of a sense of belonging I feel. So closeness in this level is about how close do I feel today? How close do I feel to my friends, my family, my colleagues? And then enjoyment, how much fun have I had? What's made me smile today? What have I enjoyed? What's been fun? So what I want you to do is to think about my day so far. How would I rate, maybe out of 10, each of those things? So how much I've achieved today, how close I feel to other people, what sense of enjoyment I've felt today. And so, for example, my day, I've delivered a course today, I've been on Jyoti today. I feel like my achievements are quite high, I'm feeling good in that department. I felt a little bit, I didn't really feel very close to anybody today, but I actually sent a voice note to a couple of friends, a little message. And that's often a good way of communicating for me because I'm dyslexic and writing is quite challenging sometimes, especially after a long day. So a voice note, and it feels more genuine. And then for my enjoyment, I felt like, oh, yeah, it's been a long day. So I went for a run, I went to look at some trees and went into a forest, and I really enjoyed that. So do yours, see how you feel about those areas. And here's some ideas of what could fit into those categories. In a very scouting context, it could be about badges, awards, it could be about school or work. It could be taking part in an online course, for example. What makes you feel close to other people? It doesn't have to be physically close to somebody. It could be a FaceTime call. doing things together. It doesn't have to be an emotionally kind of close conversation. It can be going to play football. That could help you feel close to other people. And talk about how you're feeling. Talking to people about how you're feeling and being open with your honest opinions about how you are at the moment can really help our mental health. I want you to also think about enjoyment. It might be about watching your favorite movies, looking after yourself in some way, taking part in some sort of hobby or interest. Maybe it's a scouting game or a scouting activity. And eating nice food. Like, who doesn't like a good meal, for example? Like, you'll get some sort of enjoyment from food. Food's an interesting one because it can bring up a lot of distress in people, of course, as well. So that's something we've got to be careful with. But actually, looking after our physical health very much involves looking after what we eat and making sure we're hydrated, and thinking about making sure we're looking after ourselves and having trying to enjoy maybe being with people in that kind of environment. There's also a thing called the Great Dream, which I think is very useful from a scouting point of view. It's 10 things that you can do to improve your mental health. So maybe give it a Google, have a little look at it. But the Great Dream model, for me, explains really well why scouting is good for mental health, because those 10 things for me are really good for our mental health. It's from Action for Happiness. So have a little look at that online. Think about those 10 things. Think about, how does that influence me? How does that affect me? And what 10 things have I accessed because I've been in scouting? And I hope you'll be pleasantly surprised that there's quite a lot of them. So, for example, this is some of the content from the Great Dream model. It's probably backwards for you on that camera. I'll read out a couple. Giving, doing things for others, relating, connecting to people, exercising, taking care of your body, awareness, living life mindfully, trying out, keep learning new things. They sound very, very much like scouting activities. And having a sense of direction and goals. Think about awards and badges. Resilience, finding a way to bounce back and problem solve. Emotions, looking at what's good, but also recognize when we've had a difficult day. One of my favorite things to do with scouts on camp, for example, is to think about trash, treasure, tell. 3 T's, trash, treasure, tell. So the trash is one thing I found difficult today. So at the World Scout Jamboree in 2019, we might be talking to some participants at the Jamboree or IST at the Jamboree. And we might be thinking about my trash today. I felt really tired in the morning, and there wasn't much food, and I had to walk a long way to my activity, and I felt really tired. My treasure was actually in the queue. I was speaking to a scout from Colombia, and we had a lovely chat about football, and we had a real laugh, and we took some photos, and it was really good fun. And then my tell might be, I managed to go on the zip line, and it was amazing to go on, and I took some photos of it, and I'm going to tell people about how amazing that experience was. So trash, treasure, tell. It's just one way of reflecting and acknowledging what we found difficult. And the last 2 of the Great Dream are about acceptance. So being comfortable with who I am and recognizing my own qualities and skills, and also being meaning. So being part of something bigger, which as scouting, as a worldwide family, which is there's nothing better than Jyoti to showcase that. Being part of something bigger absolutely contributes positively to our mental health. I want us to think about how we might look after ourselves. So some examples here, we could term that as self-care, just caring for ourselves. There's a mask from an airplane, a mask sign from an airplane here, the idea of putting a mask on ourselves before we put the mask on somebody else. So before we help others, we need to be able to help ourselves and make sure we're safe to do so. And we also need to acknowledge that we have limitations and boundaries. We don't want to avoid or dismiss somebody that's in need, but we also need to know that we have limitations. So a big part of looking after yourself is looking after you and making sure you stay safe. And this is very similar to how you might be in a physical first aid situation. Doctors ABC, for example, that danger, look after yourself first. Make sure that you're not putting yourself in danger. And lastly, on this side, is to put aside time to do the things that give you energy. Look at your week, think about your stress bucket, think about those ACEs, the achievement, closeness, and enjoyment, and make sure you've got time for you and time to invest in yourself, because otherwise we're going to be really low on energy and it's going to contribute to our worsening mental health. Got some other thoughts on how we might support others. Now, one of the biggest things we can think about here is trying not to solve their problems. Now, this might seem a bit strange sometimes, because sometimes somebody comes to us and they're struggling and we want to just make things better. But the reality is we need to help them solve their own problems. We need to help them by listening, by being non-judgmental, by giving them time. And very often, sometimes they don't need help. Sometimes they've got a way forward themselves and they just need to air it. When someone's anxious or low in mood, it's like they've got this storm above their head. And when they talk to you about it and you're non-judgmental, it's like they're taking it out and having a look at it with you. And when they've done that, the thing hasn't changed necessarily, but they've understood it more, they can see it more. And that can take some of the distress away just by seeing it and understanding what it is that they've got on their mind at the moment. We don't need to change that for them. But sometimes we might need to help them to get help. For example, through safe from harm or safeguarding. Or it might be to tell a scout leader or tell a teacher, or to get in contact with their doctor or healthcare provider, depending on where you are. But it's important that we help them to just tell their story and we listen to that. Empathize. Some people say it's like being in somebody else's shoes. I would say it's more about walking alongside them and really listening to what they've got to say from a place of non-judgment, from a place of kindness, from a place of I'm here to try and understand what it is you're going through. We also don't want to dismiss their worries. We don't want to be like, oh, that's a tiny thing, don't worry about it. Because they clearly already are, and simply saying to somebody not to worry about something does not help. It does not get rid of the worry. And also the biggest problem in communication is simply not listening. Really seeking to understand what they've got to say is key. Also, we can think about how do we thank you for telling me, praise them for being open, praise them for communicating about how they're feeling. Say, thank you for telling me. I really respect the fact that you've told me this. I really value you. Don't let your own judgment get in the way of what they've got to say. Sometimes you may be thinking, this doesn't seem like a massive problem. And sometimes it's because they're at a different point in life and that problem to them right now seems really big because of the meaning that that problem has to them. Whereas a problem of a similar nature may really bother you as well, and they might not see that. But it's important to try our hardest to understand that and recognize why that's difficult for them. Sometimes people will also just tell us a little bit about what's going wrong for them without actually giving us the whole story, just to see how we react. Are you a trustworthy person? And if you react with judgment, they're not going to tell you more. So recognize that actually this person needs to just tell their story and listen further to what's been going on. Thank you. So we've got 5 minutes left. I'd love to answer as many questions as I can. So a few questions here for what is mental health? What does mental health mean? Absolutely really wonderful thing. Hopefully we've answered that over the course of the last half an hour or so. So are there people that can't be mentally ill? Absolutely not. We can all experience mental health difficulties. We can all experience mental distress. It's a bit like physical health. We can all experience, and we will all experience poor physical health at some point in our life. Over the course of however long we live, that we will experience physical health. It is part of being human, as is to suffer and as to experience distress and illness. So we're all going to experience some level of movement along that continuum that we talked about. So there are certain things that maybe protect people from poor mental health, but we all experience poor mental health at some point. And sometimes we think, oh, I've never experienced a mental health problem, but I've never experienced a mental health problem yet. It can very quickly change, sadly. So it's important that we understand this and help others while we're in a good frame of mind. So there's loads of questions here about, like, what can I do to support myself? What can I do to help myself? And the biggest thing, there's a limitation on what we can answer in a short call like this, but seek out support in your community. See what is available. Depending on where you're from and what community you're in, there's all sorts of different help available, from a mental health first aid person like me, or from a therapist or a doctor. But look at what's available, and don't struggle in silence. Please do try and seek help and support. There's also support that we can access within Scouting in terms of our fellow volunteers and through Safe from Harm. There's a question here about ADHD, so attention hyperactivity disorder. That's a really, really good question, but quite specific for this call, really. So what I'd encourage you to do is have a look at a site that's useful around mental health. For example, a really good one might be the Mental Health Foundation it's a UK charity. But there's also other organisations such as the World Health Organization that produce resources on these areas of difficulty. What if you have problems connecting to others, which might still lead to feeling lonely? Absolutely. Various things in life may mean that we struggle further with making connections and meaningful connections. Something I would add to that question really is this idea of, well, what is it to me? How do I know when I'm connected to other people? Because very often we have this idea of, I should have this many friends, or I should be doing this. And those kind of ideas or rules aren't our own, they're kind of from society or from other people. So I'd say ask the question to yourself of, well, how connected, how many people do I need to be friends with? How many do I want to be friends with? Because often the pressure we have on ourselves to connect with others can be to do with what kind of ideas we have that we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Also think about where do I feel the most connection to other people? For a lot of people, that's in Scouting. And so how can I seek out those opportunities a bit more? A couple of questions there about how do we think about, how do we approach somebody if I feel like I can't tell anybody something? And I think a key thing here is to really maybe write it down, maybe look at it on paper, write out some ideas around it, really process it in your head and think about which part do I feel difficulty in telling somebody that. Really process it on paper, draw it out if you would prefer to use drawing, and then see if actually at the end of that, what is it that I want to tell somebody? What is it that I want to let somebody in on? And who are the best people to approach? And who do I trust? Who do I feel closest to? Who do I feel will be responsible with this information that I have to share? And once you've done that, perhaps you have a bit more of a plan about what you're going to do next. And I really hope whoever asked that question and has a bit of a plan once they do that process. And of course, if there are things that you feel like you can't share, but you need maybe some external help, you can always think about the Safe from Harm route from World Scouting, and that's or from your own country or NSO, and that's another route you can think about too. If you notice somebody, so this is probably the last question from today, if you notice somebody in distress, try and approach them. Make sure it's safe to do so, but try and say hello, ask twice, ask how they are, ask again, how actually are you? You might say, I've noticed that you seem quite low. I noticed that you seem anxious today. Is there anything I can do to help? Trying to approach is better than avoiding approaching altogether. And if we stay non-judgmental and we keep within our boundaries and we're kind, then often we can at least help in some way. We can't help everybody all the time, but perhaps by acting within our scouting values and by attempting to help people like we would do in physical first aid, then we will create a better world. So thank you very much for your time and thinking about this topic of mental health. I hope you have learned something, and I hope that you can take something away and go and spread the word about mental health. But thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of JT.